15 years. That is how long Adrian Volkov spent building an empire on the ruins of a broken heart. Tonight, in a gymnasium that still smells like gym chalk and old wood, the most feared man in 3 states stands perfectly still, while the woman he never stopped loving walks straight toward him through a crowd of strangers who used to be classmates. She does not flinch. She does not hesitate. And when she stops close enough that he can see the exact shade of green in her eyes, the same shade he memorized at 18 and never forgot, she asks him one question that cracks the foundation of everything he has ever built. Did you ever get my letter? Like what you hear? Hit that like button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me until the end. This one is going to hurt before it heals. The drive into Milhaven took 40 minutes from the private airstrip, and Adrian Volkov spent every one of those minutes staring out the tinted window of the Escalade at the kind of landscape that had no business making him feel anything. Flat stretches of Indiana farmland, water towers with names of towns too small to exist on any map that mattered. A grain elevator rusted the color of old blood catching the last of the October light. He had not been back in 15 years. His head of security, a thick-necked former Marine named Carver Dole, kept his eyes on the road and his mouth shut, which was the only reason Adrian had kept him employed for 6 years. Carver understood the basic architecture of working for a man like Adrian Volkov. You spoke when spoken to, you drove where you were told, and you did not ask questions about why a man who controlled $700 million in legitimate and illegitimate enterprise was returning to a town with one stoplight to attend a high school reunion. We're 20 minutes out, Carver said. I know. That was the end of that. Adrian pulled at the cuff of his jacket, black wool, Italian cut, not the kind of thing anyone in Milhaven High's graduating class of 2009 would have owned, and looked at his own reflection in the glass. 48 hours ago, he had been sitting across a conference table in Chicago from a man who controlled the port unions in 3 Great Lakes cities, negotiating the kind of arrangement that kept certain shipments moving without interference. The man across the table had been sweating even though the room was cold. They always sweated. That was how Adrian knew a meeting was going well. He did not think of himself as a cruel man. Cruel men enjoyed it. Adrian simply understood leverage, and he understood that leverage only worked if the person on the other side of the table believed you would use it. Belief was the foundation of everything he had built. Not violence, though violence existed in his world the way weather existed. Predictable in its unpredictability, necessary in its own brutal economy. What mattered was the belief, the reputation, the quiet, settled certainty that Adrian Volkov did not make idle statements. He had built that reputation on 15 years of controlled decisions, every one of them made in the hollow space where a different life should have been. He did not examine that thought for long. He had trained himself out of the habit years ago. You did not run an operation the size of the Volkov network by allowing yourself the luxury of looking backward. And yet here he was, in a car pointed directly at the past. The invitation had come through his assistant, routed through the Alumni Association's mass email, the same way it came to everyone else who had graduated from Milhaven in 2009. He had almost deleted it. He had, in fact, told his assistant to delete it. And then 3 days later, in the middle of a phone call about a labor dispute that was costing him money on the East Side distribution line, he had pulled it back out of the digital trash and held it open on his laptop screen until the person on the other end of the call said his name twice and asked if he was still there. He was not able to explain what made him respond. He did not try to. Milhaven looked the same and worse simultaneously, which was the particular cruelty of small towns. They aged in ways that made you wonder whether anything had ever actually been alive in them, or whether you had simply been too young to notice the decay. The main street had a new pharmacy where the hardware store used to be. The diner was still there, though its sign had lost 2 letters. The Methodist church still anchored the east end of the block, white clapboard gone gray at the joints. The high school gymnasium had been repainted in the last decade, its exterior an aggressively cheerful blue that felt wrong against the Indiana flatness of everything around it. Cars filled the parking lot, a mixture of minivans and modest sedans with a few newer models that suggested some of his former classmates had done reasonably well. Adrian's Escalade was, as usual, the largest vehicle present. Carver pulled into a slot near the back. You want me inside? Carver asked. No. Protocol says, I know what protocol says. I wrote it. Adrian unbuttoned the top button of his shirt, then rebuttoned it. An uncharacteristic gesture. He was aware of it. Stay with the vehicle. I have my phone. Carver's expression communicated professional disagreement without speaking it aloud, which was another thing Adrian appreciated about him. Yes, sir. Adrian stepped out of the Escalade into October air that tasted like dead leaves and the particular flat cold of the Midwest before the first frost. He stood for a moment in the parking lot, getting his bearings in the way he had learned to do in any new environment. Not new, he corrected himself, old, which was somehow worse, cataloging exits, reading the sightlines, calculating the shortest path between himself and open space. Then he walked toward the gymnasium doors. The reunion had drawn perhaps 120 people, which given a graduating class of just under 200 suggested a reasonable attendance rate. The kind of showing you got when enough years had passed that curiosity outweighed whatever discomfort people carried from their adolescence. Tables lined the walls. A DJ no one had asked for was playing low-volume pop from the mid-2000s, which was apparently what someone thought nostalgia sounded like. Name tags on a table near the entrance. Printed, not handwritten, another small sign of the passage of time. Adrian took his name tag and affixed it to his jacket with the same flat precision he brought to everything else. He moved along the perimeter of the room. People noticed him. They always noticed him, partly because he was taller than most men in any room, partly because of something in the way he occupied space. Still, watchful, the quality of attention he carried that made people instinctively aware that he was registering everything. He recognized faces in the way you recognized a landscape you had visited once as a child. General features without precise memory. The broad-shouldered boy who had been quarterback was now a broad-shouldered man with thinning hair and the careful posture of someone managing back pain. The girl who had run the student council, Lauren Hatch, was now a woman with the exhausted precision of someone who had become a teacher or an administrator. People smiled at him with the particular effort of those who did not quite remember the context for the name on his chest, but felt they should. He did not smile back. He was not unfriendly. He was simply what he had become, and what he had become did not include the performance of casual warmth. He took a glass of water from a table near the DJ and stood against the wall, watching the room settle into its patterns. Old connections reassembling, the geometry of social memory reasserting itself. Who stood with whom? Which clusters formed along the old fault lines of high school hierarchies? Which people drifted to the edges the way he had always drifted to the edges? He was thinking about leaving. He had thought about leaving since the parking lot. The honest answer to why he had come at all was sitting somewhere in his chest that he did not plan to open. And the longer he stood in this room with its paper streamers and its mid-2000s pop music and its name tags, the less he trusted himself not to open it. He was setting down the water glass when the quality of the room changed. He felt it before he processed it. A subtle shift in the attention of the people nearest the gymnasium entrance. The particular micro-adjustment people make when someone walks into a room who rearranges the room's center of gravity. Adrian had caused that effect himself enough times to recognize it from the outside. He turned his head. Isla Sterling had not changed in any of the ways that mattered. She was older, 33 now, same as him, though the math was obvious and he had not needed to do it. He had simply known it the way he knew a lot of things about her that he had spent 15 years trying to stop knowing. Her dark hair was longer than he remembered, worn loose. She had the same quality of self-contained composure he had watched from across classrooms for 4 years. Not coldness, not reserve exactly, but a kind of focused presence, as though she was always fully located in her own skin in a way most people never managed. She was wearing a dark green dress that was simple and somehow exactly right, and she was standing in the doorway reading the room the way people read rooms when they are prepared to leave them at a moment's notice. Then her eyes found him. Adrian did not move. He was not sure he breathed. Across the gym, separated by 40 feet of Indiana reunion noise, Isla Sterling looked at him for 3 full seconds without expression. Then something moved across her face. A complicated thing. The kind of expression that wanted to be several different things at once and had not yet resolved itself. And she started walking toward him. Not toward the bar. Not toward a cluster of former classmates. Toward him, with the direct, undeflected certainty of someone who had decided something. His hands were loose at his sides. He made them stay that way. She stopped close enough to speak without raising her voice over the music, close enough that he could confirm the exact shade of green in her eyes, which were the color of old river water in the fall. Not purely green, not brown, something that had no simple name, and he had the brief, disorienting sensation of the 15 years collapsing, not disappearing but collapsing, accordion folding into a single moment. She looked at his name tag, then at his face. Adrian Volkov, she said. Not a greeting exactly, more like the beginning of an accounting. Isla. His voice came out even. He was proud of that. Her jaw moved slightly, something working itself out in the architecture of her expression. I need to ask you something. Ask. Did you ever get my letter? The question landed in a part of him he thought he had successfully sealed off. He heard it, and then he heard it again, the way you sometimes hear something important twice before your mind accepts its meaning. What letter? He said. It was not quite a question because something in his chest already knew this mattered. The expression on Isla's face shifted again. Careful. Controlled in the way people are controlled when they are holding something fragile. The letter I wrote you, the night before graduation, I gave it to Celeste to deliver to you before you left for Chicago. A pause. Her voice was steady, but he could see what the steadiness was costing her. I never heard back from you. I assumed... She stopped. I assumed you read it and didn't respond. The noise of the room seemed to recede. The DJ's low-volume pop became something happening in a different building entirely. Adrian Volkov stood very still, because standing very still was the thing he did when the ground shifted beneath him and he needed to locate a new floor. I never received a letter, he said. Isla's composure held for another half-second. Then he watched it crack. Not collapse. Isla. Sterling had never been someone who collapsed, but a fracture line appeared in the careful stillness of her expression, something opening that she had been keeping closed for 15 years. What? I never received anything from you, not a letter. Nothing. Her lips parted, closed. She looked away from him, a short, sharp movement, the kind of involuntary gesture you make when the mind needs a moment to reassemble a structure that has just been taken apart. Adrian was doing the same thing, though he suspected it did not show on his face the way it was showing on hers. He had trained his face out of that particular legibility years ago. A letter. Written the night before graduation. Delivered, supposedly delivered, before he left for Chicago. He had left for Chicago at 5 in the morning. He remembered it with the precision of remembered pain. The back of his father's truck, a duffel bag, the specific gray of pre-dawn in late May, and the absolute certainty that Isla Sterling had chosen to spend the last night before graduation with Daniel Hess, who had been photographed with her at the senior bonfire, who was headed to Northwestern, who came from the kind of family that did not have the complications Adrian's family had. He had built every subsequent decision on the foundation of that certainty. Who was supposed to deliver it? He asked. His voice was very quiet. The people nearest them in the room were not paying attention. People at reunions were generally too absorbed in their own nostalgia to notice two people standing against a wall having a quiet conversation. But he kept his voice low anyway, because the controlled quiet was not about secrecy. It was about not trusting himself to volume. Isla looked back at him. Her eyes were bright in the way eyes got when something was happening behind them that the person was not allowing to the surface. Celeste, my sister, she stayed in Millhaven that summer, and I asked her to... Her voice stopped. She was supposed to give it to you before you drove out. Celeste Sterling, 4 years older than Isla, had worked at the grocery on Route 9 the summer of Adrian's graduation. He had a memory of her, a woman who had looked at him with the particular assessment of an older sibling evaluating a potential threat to someone she loved, and who had said very little on the 2 or 3 occasions their paths had crossed. He had a very cold feeling settling in his chest, the kind that had nothing to do with the October temperature outside. Is she here tonight? He said. Isla's expression answered before she did. Then Isla's gaze moved past his shoulder toward the gymnasium entrance, and her face did something complex and involuntary, a tightening that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but contained both of them. Adrian turned. Celeste Sterling was perhaps 40 feet away. having just entered through the gymnasium doors. She was scanning the room with the casual alertness of someone who did not expect to find anything surprising. And then her eyes landed on the two of them, standing against the far wall, and every casual thing about her posture evaporated. She knew. Adrian could read it from 40 feet. 40 feet was a range he could work with. He had made significant professional determinations at greater distances. What he read on Celeste Sterling's face in the moment she registered the two of them together was not the expression of a woman who was surprised to see her sister talking to an old classmate. It was the expression of a woman who had been carrying a specific weight for 15 years and had just realized the ground beneath it had opened. She recovered quickly. He noted that too. She recomposed herself with the practiced speed of someone who had spent years managing the maintenance of a particular story, and then she began moving in a direction that was not toward them. "She's leaving," Isla said quietly. "I see that." What happened next was not something Adrian planned. Planning implied deliberation, and what moved him away from the wall and across the gymnasium floor was not deliberate in any conscious sense. It was the thing underneath deliberation. The 15-year-old engine that had been running on a false premise and had just been told the premise was false. He moved through the crowd with the particular efficiency he brought to physical space, which was not aggressive but also did not invite obstruction. And people in his path found reasons to be elsewhere without entirely understanding why. He reached Celeste Sterling before she reached the exit. He did not touch her. He positioned himself in her path and stopped. And she stopped too. And for a moment they simply looked at each other in the low gymnasium light, while the DJ played something that might have been Jason Mraz, and 40 former classmates talked about their children and their mortgages around them. Celeste Sterling was a moderately attractive woman in her late 30s, with the particular careful put-togetherness of someone who was always managing how she appeared to others. She was dressed well, her hair was neat, her expression was the controlled expression of someone presenting a version of calm they did not feel. "Mr. Volkov," she said. Formal. Reaching for composure with both hands. "Walk outside with us," he said. Not a request. Not quite a command. The tone that lived in the space between those things, which was a tone he used frequently and which generally produced the desired result. Isla had followed. She was beside him now, and Adrian was aware of her presence the way you were aware of the one significant thing in a room, not intrusively, not in a way that disrupted his focus, but as a fixed point, a reference. Celeste's eyes moved between them. Her jaw tightened briefly. "I just arrived. I was going to get a—" "Celeste." Isla's voice was quiet and absolutely inflexible. "We need to talk." The three of them moved outside. The night was full dark now, October cold with a thin sliver of moon doing very little against the darkness. The parking lot spilled yellow light from its overhead fixtures, but the area behind the gymnasium, a small concrete plaza with a few picnic tables that had apparently served as a smoking area when they were students and had been repurposed into a vague outdoor gathering space with potted plants that were dying in the cold, was lit only by the diffuse glow from the gymnasium windows. They stood in that light, the three of them, and the sounds from inside became muffled and peripheral. And Celeste Sterling stood with her arms crossed and her chin lifted in the posture of someone who was preparing to defend a position they already knew was indefensible. Adrian let Isla take the first question. Whatever rights he had to this conversation, hers were older. "The letter," Isla said. "The one I gave you to deliver. Did you give it to him?" Celeste's jaw worked. Her eyes moved to Adrian, then back to her sister. The calculation happening behind her expression was not subtle enough to be invisible, at least not to someone who spent his professional life reading people under pressure. "Isla, did you give it to him?" Not a question. Not anymore. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Adrian watched it settle over Celeste's features, watched the maintenance of the composed expression become effortful in a way it had not been 30 seconds ago, and he was aware of something happening in his own chest that he did not have an immediate word for. Not rage. Rage was a sensation he recognized, and this was quieter than rage, older than rage, something that had been stored at a very low temperature for a very long time and was now beginning to register temperature for the first time. "I made a choice," Celeste said. Her voice was steady, in the way voices got steady when people were operating at the outer limit of their composure. "I made a choice that I believed was in your best interest." Isla went absolutely still, the kind of still that was not calm. Adrian spoke before either of them. What choice? His voice was flat, controlled, the voice he used when he needed precision from someone and was prepared to wait as long as it took. Celeste's eyes came to him and held there with an effort that was visible. She was 18 years old, she said. You were leaving for Chicago. Your family… She stopped. Started again. I knew what your family was involved in. Everyone in Millhaven knew. I wasn't going to let my sister… So you kept it. Isla's voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, which was far more frightening, Adrian thought, than if she had shouted. You kept my letter. Another silence. Then, yes. The word fell into the concrete plaza and did not bounce. Isla Sterling did not respond immediately. She stood in the yellow-edged dark and breathed, and Adrian watched her absorb the word with the focused attention of someone documenting damage. Not dramatically, not with the kind of performed emotion that made damage into spectacle, but the quiet, careful cataloging of a person who was dealing with the information that 15 years of their life had been built on a lie someone else chose to tell. He was doing the same thing. He was simply better at not showing it. 15 years. He had been in Chicago for 3 months before he accepted that she was not going to reach out. 6 months before he made the first truly violent decision of his professional career. A decision he had been avoiding, and which he had been able to avoid partly because he had not yet become the kind of man to whom violence was a professional option, and partly because something in him had still been oriented toward the possibility of a different life. By the end of that first year in Chicago, that orientation was gone. He had replaced it with discipline, with the architecture of the life he had eventually built, with the absolute controlled efficiency of a man who had decided that wanting things was a liability. He had wanted one thing, once. He had decided she had chosen not to want it back. Celeste Sterling had decided for both of them. I need to ask you something, Adrian said. His voice was very quiet. In professional contexts, the quietness of his voice under pressure was something the people around him had learned to treat as a serious indicator. Here, it was simply what was available to him. You told Isla you destroyed the letter. Celeste's composure developed a fissure. Small. Visible. I said, she told me, Isla said, and her voice carried the new flatness of someone who was recalibrating a large number of things simultaneously. When I eventually asked about it, years later, you told me you'd burned it. Celeste uncrossed her arms, crossed them again. A gesture that wanted to be the gesture of someone settling into a position but could not manage it. I couldn't. The admission came out smaller than everything preceding it. I couldn't actually burn it. Her voice thinned. I kept it. Isla's head tilted very slightly. What? I still have it. I have the envelope. Celeste's face was doing something complicated and involuntary. The features of someone watching the structure they have maintained for a decade and a half develop cracks in real time. I never opened it. The seal was never broken. I kept it in a box, and I moved it every time I moved, and I told myself every year that I would get rid of it, and She stopped talking. The October night held the silence for a moment. Adrian Volkov stood in the diffuse gymnasium light behind Millhaven High School, 15 years from the last time he had stood in this parking lot with a duffel bag at 5 a.m, and the specific flat certainty that the life he had wanted was not the life that was available to him, and he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what Celeste Sterling had just said. A sealed envelope, 15 years old. Isla's handwriting on the outside, and inside it the words of an 18-year-old girl who had believed enough in something to write them down and ask her sister to carry them across town, and the seal unbroken, and the words still inside, unread, preserved in the amber of a choice Celeste had made one June night in Millhaven, Indiana, while both of them were somewhere else becoming the people they had never planned to become. I want it, Isla said. Her voice had a quality now that Adrian recognized from his own voice at certain specific professional moments. The tone of a decision fully made, without performance, without residual negotiation. I want the envelope. Tonight. Celeste looked at her sister, then she looked at Adrian. Whatever she found in Adrian's expression, and he made no particular effort to make it readable, but he also made no effort to disguise what was there, seemed to complete something in her own decision-making process. It's at my house, she said. Then we'll go to your house, Isla said. Celeste Sterling nodded once, and in the nodding was something Adrian read as the particular physical relief of someone who has been holding a position for so long that the surrender of it, when it finally comes, is not entirely unwelcome, which made him feel something toward her that was not forgiveness. It was too soon, and he was not built for quick forgiveness, whatever else he might be, but was a modulation of what he had felt 30 seconds ago. People were capable of sustaining lies that had once seemed like love for a very long time. He knew this. It did not make the lies less destructive. It made them human, which was almost worse. They left the concrete plaza. Behind them, through the gymnasium wall, the DJ had moved on to something from 2007 that no one had asked to remember. The parking lot was still and cold under its yellow lights. At the Escalade, Carver straightened from where he had been leaning against the hood and looked at Adrian with the particular attention of someone reading a situation for threat level. "Change of plan," Adrian said. "We're following Ms. Sterling's vehicle." Carver looked at the two women, then back at Adrian. "Understood," he said, which was the correct response and the only response Adrian had expected. The three of them walked to their respective vehicles in the Indiana dark, and Isla's hand brushed Adrian's arm once, briefly, as she turned toward her rental car. She did not look at him when she did it. He was not certain it was intentional. But the contact, 5 seconds, through the fabric of a jacket that cost more than most people's monthly rent, registered in him with a precision that suggested his nervous system had been waiting 15 years to receive it. He got into the Escalade. Carver did not speak. Celeste's sedan pulled out of the lot and turned north on Miller Road, and Adrian watched its taillights and thought about a sealed envelope in a box in a house he had never been inside, and thought about the version of himself that had climbed into the back of his father's truck at 5 in the morning with a duffel bag and not once looked back, because looking back had seemed like the cruelest possible thing he could do to himself. He had been wrong about what was cruel. The realization was not dramatic. It did not arrive with the sensation of something breaking. It arrived the way most true things arrived in his experience, quietly, with the flat certainty of a fact that had always been true and had simply been waiting for the evidence to catch up. Carver followed the sedan's taillights north through the October dark of Millhaven, Indiana, and Adrian Volkov sat in the back of the Escalade with his hands loose in his lap and thought about 15 years of empire built in the wrong direction, and did not yet know what he would do with that thought, but knew with the absolute certainty of a man who had built his entire life on reading situations accurately that whatever was inside that envelope was going to require him to become someone he had not been in a very long time, possibly someone he had never been. The sealed envelope, the unbroken seal, the words of an 18-year-old girl who had believed in him enough to write them down. Carver turned north, and the gymnasium lights fell away behind them, and the Indiana night opened ahead of them, and Adrian Volkov did not look back. Celeste Sterling lived 12 minutes from the high school in a ranch-style house on Decker Lane that sat behind a row of spruce trees tall enough to block the streetlight. The neighborhood was the kind of quiet that did not feel peaceful. It felt like everyone had agreed not to make noise about the things that bothered them, which was a different thing entirely. The porch light was on when they pulled up, amber and thin against the October dark, and the house looked like a place where someone had taken reasonable care of reasonable things for a long time, without any particular joy in the process. Adrian stepped out of the Escalade and stood in the driveway while Isla got out of her rental, and Celeste unlocked the front door with hands that were not quite steady. He could see it from 8 feet away. The slight fumble of the key, the over-controlled deliberateness of a person managing fine motor function under psychological pressure. He did not comment on it. He cataloged it the way he cataloged everything. Not cruelly, not with satisfaction, simply as data. Carver remained at the vehicles. Adrian had not needed to say it. The inside of the house was neat in the way of someone who cleaned when they were anxious, which meant it was very neat. A living room with furniture arranged at precise angles. Framed photographs on the walls. Adrian registered them peripherally as he moved through the space. Family images with the particular composition of people who had documented the surface of their lives with care. He looked for any image that contained the three of them, Adrian's high school self and the Sterling sisters, and found none, which was not surprising but told him something about how Celeste had been managing the weight of this. She had not been displaying it. She had been containing it. "Sit down," Celeste said, gesturing toward the living room. The invitation came out more like a request for time than an act of hospitality. No, Isla said. The single syllable landed in the clean living room like a stone into still water. Celeste turned to look at her sister, and what passed between them in that look had the density of sisters. Years of small violences and small forgivenesses, the complicated ledger of shared history, all of it activated and none of it resolved. Isla. The box, Celeste. Where is it? Celeste's jaw tightened. She looked at Adrian, as though looking at him might produce some moderating influence, and he looked back at her with the specific blankness of a man who had decided to let this play out at whatever speed it needed to play out. He was not going to be a moderating influence. He was not sure he was capable of it tonight. Celeste left the room. The sound of her footsteps moved down the hallway. A door opening, the sounds of a closet, the particular acoustic signature of things being moved. Isla stood in the living room with her arms at her sides and stared at the middle distance, and Adrian stood near the entrance to the room and watched her do it. She was breathing with more control than the situation required, which meant she was working to control it. Short, measured. Her shoulders carried a tension that made the lines of her body angular in a way they had not been at the reunion 20 minutes ago. She had walked into the gymnasium with something like composure. That composure was still present, technically, but it had changed quality. It was now the composure of a person performing a function under load, the way a structure under stress continues to hold its shape right up until the point that it doesn't. "You all right?" he said. Not a gentle question, just a question. She glanced at him. "Ask me that again in 10 minutes. "Fair enough." She looked away, then back. Something working across her face that he did not rush. 15 years, she said. Very flat. I spent actual years telling myself that I had misread everything, that I had invented something between us that wasn't there. I restructured my entire memory of the 4 years we spent in the same school to make your silence make sense. She paused. I made you into someone who had never cared at all, because that was the only version of the story where your silence made sense. Adrian absorbed this. The words were not accusations. They were information, delivered with the deliberate precision of someone who had decided not to waste the delivery on emotion. What version of me did you end up with? He asked. Someone cold, she said. Someone who let a girl pour her heart out and just decided not to answer. I told myself you were always going to become what you became, that the silence was just the first evidence of it. The honesty of it was not comfortable. He did not need it to be comfortable. You weren't wrong about what I became. I was wrong about why. The footsteps in the hallway returned before he could respond to that. Celeste came back into the living room carrying a shoebox. It was a plain brown shoebox, the kind that came with mid-range dress shoes, worn at the corners in the way of something that had been moved many times and handled with the specific careful infrequency of something that mattered enough to keep and was handled as little as possible to make the keeping bearable. She set it on the coffee table and did not immediately open it, her hands resting on the lid. She started. Don't, Isla said. Isla, I need you to understand. I don't need anything from you right now except the envelope. Isla's voice had not risen. It was, if anything, quieter than before, and the quiet had the quality of something compressed, enormous pressure in a very small container. Whatever you need me to understand can wait. The envelope first, then you can say whatever you need to say. Celeste opened the box. Adrian did not move closer. He remained where he was near the entrance to the room and watched Celeste push aside what appeared to be a small collection of items. Ticket stubs, a photograph, the kind of material artifacts people kept when they were building a container for guilt, and extract a cream-colored envelope from near the bottom. It had the particular slightly yellowed quality of paper that had aged well in the dark, not decayed but transformed, the way ivory looks different from white. His name was written on the front in handwriting he had never seen before and somehow recognized immediately as hers. A careful, slanted hand that had clearly been held at the edge of its own precision by whatever state its writer was in when she formed the letters. Adrian Volkov. That was all it said. No address. It had never been intended for a mailbox. Isla took it from Celeste's hands without ceremony and held it. and Adrian watched her look at her own 18-year-old handwriting on an envelope that had not moved from a shoebox in a closet, while both of them had spent 15 years becoming entirely different people. Her thumb moved once across the surface of the envelope, a small, involuntary gesture, and then she held it at her side. "Now," she said, "now you can talk." Celeste sat down on the couch. She sat the way people sat when the structure holding them upright had been partially removed, carefully, with the deliberate attention of someone who was not sure their legs would cooperate if they didn't pay close attention. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs. "I want you to understand that I genuinely believed, that I was protecting you," she said. Her voice was doing the work of steadiness with visible effort. "You were 18 years old. You were the most talented person I had ever known, and you had a full scholarship to an art program in Columbus and a future that had nothing to do with—" Her eyes moved to Adrian, back to her sister. His family had a reputation in this town that went back to his father and his father's father. "I was 22 years old, and I was terrified that you were going to throw everything away for a boy who came from—" "From what?" Adrian said. His voice was very quiet. Celeste looked at him. "From something I didn't think you'd survive." The room held the statement for a moment. Adrian took a breath that was slower than the others. He had been called many things, and his family had been characterized in many ways, most of them not inaccurate. He was not offended by the description of his background. He had built his adult life on that background with full knowledge of what it was. What he felt at Celeste's words was not offense. It was the very specific, very cold recognition of someone who had just been told that their entire adult life, everything they had built, every decision made in the absence of the thing they wanted, every wall constructed in the architecture of not being the person who wanted things, had been built because a 22-year-old had decided to intercept a letter. "She deserved to make that choice herself," he said. "I know that now. You knew it then too. Not aggressive, not loud, just accurate. You knew it, and you made the other choice anyway." Celeste's jaw worked. Her eyes went bright. "Yes," she said very quietly. "I did." Isla had been standing still through this exchange with her arms crossed and the envelope held against her side. Now she exhaled through her nose, a short, controlled sound, and moved to the armchair across from the couch and sat down in it, not relaxing into it, but occupying it, her spine straight, both feet on the floor. "Tell me what you told me," she said to Celeste. "After graduation, when I asked you about it." Celeste closed her eyes briefly. "I told you I had given it to him. And when I asked you again, a year later, I told you the same thing, 3 years later. When I called you from Columbus and told you I had seen an article about him in the Tribune, the crime section, and I told you I needed to know the truth about what had happened between us. I told you I had given him the letter," Celeste said. The repetition of it was its own punishment, and the way Celeste's face absorbed the repetition made that clear. "I told you he had received it and chosen not to respond. She stopped, started again. "I told you that he had made his choice." "He made his choice," Isla repeated. "That's what you said. He made his choice." "Yes. So for 15 years I carried the understanding that this man—" Isla's voice did not break. It thinned. It thinned down to something barely wide enough to carry words. "Had looked at everything I felt for him and decided it wasn't worth a response. Not a phone call, not a note, not even the basic decency of telling me no. I carried that." Her voice recovered slightly. "I used that. Every time I started to feel something for someone else and talked myself out of it, every time I told myself I was too much, or expected too much, or hoped for too much, I went back to that. To the fact that the only person I had ever—" She stopped herself. The stopping was visible, a physical act. "I used your lie as evidence about myself. For 15 years. Celeste Sterling was crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and continuously, the way people cried when the thing they were crying about had been building long enough that there was no drama left in the release, only the release itself. She was not reaching for tissues. She was simply sitting with it, which was the most honest thing she had done all evening. "I'm sorry," she said. And then again, "I'm sorry. I know that isn't enough. I know that." Isla looked at her sister for a long time. The look was not warm. It was not cruel. It was the look of someone doing a very difficult calculation with incomplete information, trying to add up what was owed against what was left, and determine whether the math could ever resolve. No, Isla said finally. It isn't enough. She looked at the envelope in her hands. But I'm done letting things that happen to me in this town define every decision I make for the rest of my life. So, she set the envelope on the coffee table, in the space between herself and her sister, and looked at it. I need a minute, she said. With him. Alone. Celeste looked up, then nodded, once. She stood from the couch with the careful deliberateness of someone operating on reduced reserves, and walked down the hallway, and a door opened and closed somewhere in the back of the house. The living room was quiet. Adrian was still standing near the entrance. The envelope was on the coffee table between the couch and the armchair. Isla looked at it, and then at him. Sit down, she said. And unlike when Celeste had said it, this was not a request for time, it was an opening. He crossed the room and sat on the couch, which put him close to the coffee table and close to her in the armchair, though not close enough to be inappropriate given everything that had just been said and everything that hadn't. He looked at the envelope, his name in her 18-year-old hand. Tell me something, Isla said. And tell me straight, not whatever version you're managing right now, the real thing. Ask it. When you left, when you drove away that morning, her eyes were on him, direct and unsentimental. Was there anything between us? Or was I reading something that wasn't there? He did not look away from her. You know the answer to that. I need to hear it. A pause. Not the pause of avoidance. The pause of a man locating the honest word in a vocabulary that had been redirected for a very long time. You were the only person in that school who He stopped. Found the word again. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't have the language for it. I watched you every day for 4 years, and I told myself that you had no reason to look back at me, and so I didn't. He stopped again, more briefly. Yes, there was something. There was something I never said because I thought the saying of it would only embarrass both of us. Isla Sterling was very still. You thought I wouldn't want to hear it. I thought you were being kind the times you talked to me. I thought it was who you were. Not, he paused. Not specific to me. She let that sit for a moment. Then, I wrote that letter 4 times. The first 3 drafts I threw away because I kept hedging, kept softening it, kept trying to make it something I could survive being ignored about. A brief, hard exhale through her nose. The 4th draft I wrote at 2 in the morning, and I didn't hedge anything. I said exactly what I felt. And I gave it to Celeste, and I went to bed, and I lay there for 3 hours thinking about whether you would actually receive it. And then I got on a bus to Columbus and spent the entire drive trying to remember if I had made a catastrophic mistake. She paused. The not hearing back, it felt like the answer. I thought the universe had answered for me. There is no universe answering, Adrian said. There was your sister in a hallway making a decision. I know that now. She looked at the envelope again. Open it with me. He looked at her. It's yours. I wrote it to you. Open it with me. He leaned forward and picked up the envelope from the coffee table. It was lighter than 15 years of consequence had any right to be. The paper had the particular slight stiffness of something that had dried after possibly being handled with not entirely dry hands, once, a long time ago. The seal on the back was unbroken, the flap intact, exactly as Celeste had said. He turned it over once, looked at his name on the front again, and then held it out to Isla. She took it. Their fingers overlapped on the edge of the envelope for approximately 2 seconds, and neither of them adjusted for it. She broke the seal. She withdrew 2 pages, folded in thirds, covered on both sides in the same careful slanted handwriting as the envelope. She unfolded them slowly. He watched her face as she read the first line, and what moved across her expression in that moment was something he did not have a name for. Recognition and grief and something else, something that had not yet decided what it was going to be. She looked up at him. Do you want me to read it to you? Yes, he said. She read. He did not look at the pages while she read. He watched her face, which was the more important text. The words themselves were the words of an 18-year-old girl who had been very young and very certain about something. And they were not sophisticated words, and they were not literary words. And they were the most honest thing he had heard in 15 years. He absorbed them through Isla's voice, which was steady for the first 3/4 of the letter, and then began to develop the particular quality of controlled vocal production that people employed when they were managing what the words cost them. And by the last paragraph, she was reading quietly and with the specific care of someone handling something fragile that was also their own. She read the last line, folded the pages once, set them on her knee with her palm flat over them. The living room was quiet. "I would have come," Adrian said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, with a quality he did not generally permit. "If I had received that letter, I would have driven to Columbus the same day." Isla looked at him. Her eyes were very bright. "I know," she said. "I know that now. I would have—" He stopped. There was no productive direction for the sentence. What he would have done existed only in a version of the last 15 years that had not happened, and the list of what would have been different in that version was long enough to be its own kind of grief. He did not perform the grief. He sat with it in the specific private way of a man who had spent 15 years performing its absence. "I know it doesn't change what happened." "No," she said, "it doesn't." And then, "But it changes what I knew, and that's not nothing." From somewhere in the back of the house, behind a closed door, they could hear Celeste crying. Not loudly, steadily. Isla looked in the direction of the sound. Her expression did something complicated. The calculation was visible. The weight of a sister's betrayal against the weight of a sister's years of carrying it. All of it too recent and too sharp to resolve in a ranch house in Millhaven on a Tuesday night in October. "I can't forgive her tonight," Isla said. "You don't have to." "I don't know if I forgive her ever." "Also, you're right." She looked at him. "You're very calm about this." "I'm not calm," he said. "I'm controlled. That's a different thing." A beat. Then something moved across Isla's face that was not quite a smile and was not its absence. It was something that existed in the space between those two things, recognized and exhausted and alive. "Yeah," she said. "I know the difference." He looked at her. She looked at him. The envelope was on the coffee table. The pages were under her palm. 15 years were in the room with them, taking up significant space, and the future, whatever the future was, had not yet announced itself. Then his phone went off. He pulled it from his inside pocket with the automatic reflex of a man for whom a vibrating phone at 11 at night was never ambient noise. The screen showed Dimitri, which was the name of his operations coordinator in Chicago, a man who did not call after 10 unless the information could not wait until morning. He looked at the phone, looked at Isla. "You need to take it," she said. Not a question. She had already read the shift in him. The thing that happened in his face and posture when the other world intruded, the professional reflex that 15 years in the Volkov network had made automatic. He stood, crossed to the far side of the room, and answered. "Dimitri, we have a problem." Dimitri's voice had the flat, controlled quality of a professional delivering bad information without escalation. "The Harkin situation. The arrangement we closed last week, someone moved on it before we could establish the boundary documentation. There's a competing claim being made, and the party making it is suggesting your involvement in the original arrangement was unauthorized." Adrian turned very slightly so his back was to the room. His voice dropped to the register he used for operational calls, which was not angry and was not loud and contained in its quietness, a very clear indication of the weight behind it. "Who is making the claim?" "Rourke, Marcus Rourke. He's suggesting that the arrangement should have cleared through him given the geography." "Rourke doesn't own that geography. He leases it. He's not saying he owns it. He's saying courtesy required you to clear it. And he's saying that the fact that you didn't is something he intends to revisit." A pause. Short. Adrian was doing the rapid calculation that 15 years of operational decisions had made instinctive, assessing the actual threat beneath the stated grievance, separating posture from intent, determining what Marcus Rourke actually wanted against what he was claiming to want. "I'll handle it," he said. "Not tonight." "He's expecting a response by morning." "Then he'll have one by morning. I'll call you from the road." He ended the call. He stood for a moment with his back to the room, his phone in his hand, and allowed the two worlds to exist simultaneously in him. The one in the living room behind him with the envelope and the pages and Isla's voice reading 15-year-old words, and the one on the phone with Dimitri and Marcus Rourke and the Harkin arrangement, and the machinery of an empire that did not stop running because its architect was standing in a ranch house in Mill Haven, Indiana, processing a stolen letter. He turned back to the room. Isla was watching him with an expression that was not quite readable, but contained in its quietness, a kind of recognition that was not entirely comfortable. "The other life," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment, not judging, not frightened, seeing, which was somehow more significant than either. "How serious?" "Manageable." He put the phone back in his pocket. "But I need to return to Chicago in the morning." Something moved across her face, quickly, controlled quickly. "Of course." "Isla." She looked at him. "Give me your number," he said. "Not—" He stopped himself before the hedging started. He had spent 15 years hedging and was done with it. "I'm asking you to let me call you. From Chicago. When I've handled what needs handling. I'm asking you to not make a decision about what this is or isn't before I've had the chance to—" He paused. Found the word. "Before I've had the chance to be something other than the person who just got off that call." Isla Sterling looked at him for a long time. Outside, the October wind moved through the spruce trees, and the house made the small sounds of a house at night. And from the back of the house, Celeste had gone quiet, in the way of someone who had exhausted themselves. Then Isla reached into her bag, found a business card, and held it out to him. He took it. Their fingers overlapped on its edge again, and this time neither of them was in a hurry. "Handle your business," she said. "Then call me." He pocketed the card. He moved toward the entrance of the living room, then stopped. Something needed to be said, and he was going to say it, which was itself something new. "I need you to know something," he said. "Whatever I built in Chicago, I built it in the wrong direction. I built it away from something, not toward anything. And I've known that for—" He paused. "For longer than I've been willing to admit." He looked at her. "I'm telling you now so that when I call you from Chicago, you understand that the call isn't coming from the man on that phone just now. It's coming from someone trying to remember who he was before he became him." Isla Sterling held his gaze. The bright quality was back in her eyes, controlled and present. "I'll be waiting to meet him," she said. He left. In the Escalade, Carver did not speak. He started the engine. The heater came on. Adrian sat in the back seat with Isla's business card in his breast pocket and his phone in his hand and stared at the street ahead as Carver pulled away from Decker Lane. He had a call to make to Dimitri. He had a response to formulate for Marcus Rourke. He had the machinery of the Volkov network running at 300 miles per hour and demanding his attention with the totality it always demanded. And behind all of it, in the specific quiet place that operational necessity could not fully reach, he was carrying the sound of Isla's voice, reading the words she had written at 18, and the weight of the pages under her palm, and the sealed envelope torn open on a coffee table in Mill Haven, and the full understanding, clear, cold, undeniable, that the 15 years he had spent building in the wrong direction had been built on a foundation that someone else had destroyed before it ever had the chance to hold anything. He had two things to do now: handle Marcus Rourke, and then dismantle, piece by careful piece, everything he had built on that broken foundation, and figure out what, if anything, could be built correctly in its place. Carver drove north. The Indiana dark closed around them. And somewhere behind them in a ranch house on Decker Lane, a sealed envelope sat open on a coffee table, and the letter inside it lay in 2 pages on a woman's knee, and 15 years of silence finally had a name. The call to Dimitri lasted 40 minutes and took place in a parking structure on the north side of Chicago, while Carver sat in the Escalade 2 levels below, and Adrian stood at the concrete barrier on level 4 and looked out at the city skyline and conducted the conversation with the controlled precision of a man who had not slept in 22 hours and was not going to allow that fact to be legible in his voice. Marcus Rourke was not a new problem. He was an old problem that had been managed through a combination of territorial clarity and the mutual understanding that certain arrangements benefited everyone more than conflict did. The Harkin situation, a distribution agreement covering 3 warehouse facilities in the Northwest Corridor that Adrian had closed the previous week, had apparently crossed a boundary that Rourke considered implicit without anyone having told Adrian it existed, which was either a genuine miscommunication or a manufactured grievance designed to establish leverage, and the difference between those two things mattered enormously. "What exactly is he saying he wants?" Adrian said. "He hasn't said explicitly. He's saying he wants a conversation with conditions. He mentioned the East Side line, specifically the Lakeview segment." Adrian was quiet for a moment. The Lakeview segment was not something he had offered to anyone, and was not something on the table. The fact that Rourke had named it as part of a grievance about a Northwest Corridor arrangement meant either that Rourke was testing the scope of what Adrian would tolerate, or that someone had told Rourke the Lakeview segment was worth asking about, which meant someone in Adrian's operation had been discussing things they had no business discussing. "Set the meeting," Adrian said, "at day after tomorrow. My building, not his. He'll want neutral ground. He can want whatever he likes. My building. Tell him the Harkins situation will be addressed at the meeting. Don't tell him anything else." He ended the call and stood at the concrete barrier for a moment, with the wind off Lake Michigan moving through the open structure at the particular temperature of Chicago in late October, which was a different cold from Indiana. Harder, more urban. The cold of a city that had decided not to accommodate discomfort, but to simply coexist with it. He thought about Isla's voice reading the letter. He put the thought away. Not permanently. In a specific location where it would be available when the current situation permitted access to it. He went back down to the Escalade. The next 36 hours were operational. He moved through them with the efficiency he had developed over 15 years of running an organization that required continuous attention. Meetings, calls, the review of the documentation surrounding the Harkin arrangement, the quiet lateral investigation into who in his network had been feeding Rourke information about the Lakeview segment. That last piece he handled personally, not through Dimitri, because the nature of internal information leaks was such that you did not ask the people who might be compromised to help you identify the compromise. He found the answer on the second day, 4 hours before the scheduled meeting with Rourke, in the form of a pattern in his communications log that should not have existed. He sat with that pattern for a long time. The communications log showed a series of encrypted channel contacts. Brief, irregularly spaced, the kind of contact pattern that was designed to look like noise rather than signal. Routed through a relay that traced back, after 3 layers of decryption that took his technical team 2 hours to work through, to a phone registered to a name he knew very well. Gregor Selby. Gregor Selby had been with the Volkov operation for 11 years. He was 38 years old, competent, careful, and had been running the East Side distribution coordination, including the Lakeview segment, for the last 4 years. He was not flashy, and he was not ambitious in the visible way of men who wanted more than they had earned. He was the kind of man who appeared to have found his level and settled into it with professional satisfaction. Adrian had trusted him with operational details that almost no one else carried. He sat in his office on the 14th floor of the Volkov building, a glass and steel structure in River North that housed 3 legitimate businesses, and in its lower floors the administrative center of everything that was not legitimate, and looked at the communications log on his laptop screen and allowed the information to settle into him completely before he did anything with it. Gregor Selby had been feeding Marcus Rourke information about the Lakeview segment for, by the pattern in the log, approximately 8 months. 8 months. While Adrian had been conducting business with him in this building, across tables in this office, on calls where Adrian had been direct about operational specifics in the way you were direct with someone you trusted. 8 months of Gregor Selby sitting in the chair across from Adrian's desk and carrying information out of this building and delivering it to a competing interest. The Harkin situation was not a miscommunication. It was a provocation. Rourke had used the information Selby gave him to manufacture a grievance specifically designed to open a conversation about the Lakeview segment. The piece of the operation that Selby had told him was valuable and potentially accessible if the right pressure was applied at the right moment. Adrian closed the laptop. He called Carver. "Find Selby," he said. "I need him in the building within the hour." A pause. Carver was a man who understood the implications of tone. "Yes, sir." Gregor Selby arrived 45 minutes later, which told Adrian something about his state of mind. A man with a clean conscience might have taken longer, called back to confirm, asked what it was about. Selby came immediately, which was the behavior of someone who had been waiting for a summons and had prepared for it. He came into the office with the composed, slightly watchful expression of a man who had decided on a version of himself and was committed to maintaining it. He was medium height, dark-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent years in environments where stillness was a survival mechanism. He sat in the chair across from Adrian's desk, the same chair he always sat in, and looked at Adrian with an expression of professional attentiveness. Adrian looked at him for a long moment without speaking. The silence in the office had a specific quality that it got when something serious was being handled, something to do with the way Adrian occupied the quiet. Not filling it, not giving it back, simply holding it until the other person in the room had to decide what to do with the pressure of it. Selby held the silence for approximately 40 seconds, which was longer than most people managed. Then his jaw moved slightly, a micro-expression, the kind of thing you caught only if you were watching for it. "You want to tell me something," Adrian said. Selby's expression shifted in the way of someone recalibrating. "Should I?" "That depends on whether you want this to be a conversation or an accounting." A beat. Something moved through Selby's composure. Not visible panic, not the blunt breakdown of someone caught without preparation, but the subtle systematic adjustment of a man who had prepared multiple positions and was now determining which one to occupy. "I don't know what you're—" "Gregor," Adrian's voice was very flat. "I have the log. I have the relay. I have 8 months of contact pattern between your channel and a phone that traces to Rourke's secondary operation. Don't spend the next 5 minutes of your life telling me you don't know what I'm talking about." The silence that followed was different from the preceding one. The preceding silence had been pressure. This silence was the sound of a position collapsing. Selby put both hands flat on his thighs. He looked at the desk between them rather than at Adrian. "It wasn't—" He stopped. Started differently. "Rourke approached me 14 months ago. He approached me through a contact I have nothing to do with now." "What did he offer you?" "Protection. A position in his operation if the situation here changed. If I was removed." Selby's jaw tightened. "That was the framing he used, yes." Adrian absorbed this with the absolute stillness of a man who had trained himself to receive information before responding to it. The thing in his chest was not rage. It was something older and colder. The specific temperature of a deep betrayal from someone you had extended real trust to, which was a temperature he knew but did not often encounter because he did not often extend real trust. "Did he tell you he was planning to move on me?" Adrian said. "He said the landscape was changing. He said that within 2 years, the Volkov operation would either be restructured or absorbed, and that people who positioned themselves correctly now would come out—" Selby stopped. He appeared to hear, belatedly, the full weight of what he was saying in the room where he was saying it. "I didn't give him operational specifics on anything critical. The Lakeview segment, I told him it existed and that it was significant. I didn't give him the infrastructure." "You gave him enough to build a provocation." "Yes." The word came out very small. Adrian stood up from his desk. Not fast, slowly, with the deliberate quality of someone who was choosing every physical action carefully. He moved to the window and stood with his back to Selby, looking out at the Chicago skyline in the mid-afternoon light, at the city that had been his for 15 years, that he had built and maintained and defended with the full scope of everything he was. The city looked exactly the same as it had looked yesterday. That was the thing about betrayals in his world. They did not change the landscape. They changed the map. The territory stayed, but your understanding of what was on it had to be rebuilt from the beginning. "Rourke is coming here in 3 hours, Adrian said. Selby said nothing. "He's coming here because you gave him the information that made him believe he had leverage. He's going to sit across that table and tell me what he wants. And what he wants is the Lakeview segment. And what he's going to use as his position is the implicit threat that if I don't give him an acceptable arrangement, the information he has about my operation." Adrian stopped, turned. "What else did you give him, Gregor? Not the Lakeview segment. What else?" Selby's face was the face of a man who had run out of positions. He was not crying. He was not performing remorse in any of its recognizable shapes. He was simply sitting in a chair across from a man he had spent 8 months betraying and absorbing the reality of the moment with the flat, exhausted clarity of someone who had known, at some level, that the moment was coming. "The Harkin arrangement," Selby said, "the full documentation. Not just the geography, the principles, the amounts, the routing." Adrian was very still. "He has everything," Selby said. If he takes that to the right people, federal, not... He stopped. He has enough to open an investigation that would take you 2 years to manage, even if you survived it. The room was quiet for a long time. What Marcus Rourke had was not leverage. It was a detonator. He had constructed, through 8 months of Gregor Selby's cooperation, a package of information sufficient to initiate federal attention on the Volkov operation at a level that would be catastrophic, not immediately fatal, because Adrian had constructed his legitimate business architecture with exactly this kind of scenario in mind, but damaging enough and prolonged enough that the operation would be operating under a microscope for years, which in his world was a condition that created the kind of vulnerability that people died from. And Rourke was going to walk into this building in 3 hours and present that detonator as a negotiating position. Adrian looked at Gregor Selby. He looked at him for a long time, in the specific way he looked at things when he was making an irreversible determination, and Selby absorbed the look with the stillness of a man who understood what it meant. "Who else knows you're here?" Adrian said. "No one. You called me directly." "Does Rourke know you're here?" A pause. "No. He doesn't know I received a summons." Adrian walked back to his desk and sat down. He picked up his phone and called Carver and said, "I need you to take Mr. Selby somewhere quiet and keep him there until I call you. He's not to have his phone." He set the phone down and looked at Selby. "You're going to stay available. When this meeting is done, we're going to have a longer conversation about your future, and the shape of that conversation depends entirely on how useful you are to me in the next 3 hours." Selby stood from the chair. He did not protest. He did not attempt to negotiate additional terms. He had the look of a man who understood that he was operating in a narrow corridor between 2 very bad outcomes, and that the width of that corridor was determined entirely by someone else. Carver appeared at the office door, and Selby went with him without speaking. Adrian sat alone. He had 3 hours before Marcus Rourke walked into this building with a detonator and sat across his desk and presented a choice that was not a choice. Give up the Lakeview segment, accept a restructured arrangement that effectively placed a portion of his operation under Rourke's authority, or face the consequences of Rourke presenting the Harkin documentation to people who could use it. He had built the Volkov operation on the principle that leverage only worked if the other party believed you would use it. Rourke believed he had leverage. The question was whether the leverage was real, whether Rourke would actually detonate what he was holding, knowing that the fallout would be mutual and that the federal attention generated by the Harkin documentation would not stay neatly contained to the Volkov operation. The answer to that question depended on how much Rourke wanted the Lakeview segment relative to how much he valued his own operational security, which was a calculation Adrian could not complete with certainty because Selby had spent 8 months feeding Rourke information, and Adrian did not yet know the full scope of what that information had allowed Rourke to build or insulate against. He opened his laptop. He pulled up everything he had on Marcus Rourke. Operational history, known associates, documented arrangements, the pattern of decisions over the last 3 years that would tell him something about Rourke's risk tolerance and his actual versus stated objectives. He worked for 2 hours. What he found did not comfort him. Marcus Rourke had spent the last 18 months quietly restructuring his operation in ways that were consistent with a man who was preparing to absorb a significant territorial expansion. New personnel in key coordination roles, quietly strengthened relationships with 2 port authorities that overlapped with Volkov distribution geography. A pattern of small, careful moves that individually looked like routine maintenance, but together described a deliberate strategic positioning. Rourke was not bluffing. He had not come to negotiate. He had come to collect. The question, the actual operative question that Adrian had to answer before Rourke walked through the door, was whether Adrian was willing to do what would be necessary to prevent the collection. Not the moderate version of necessary, the full version. The version that lived in the part of his operation that he had always maintained at arm's length from himself. The part that handled situations that could not be handled by negotiation or leverage or the quiet enforcement of territorial agreements. He sat with that question, and then his personal phone, not the operational phone, the personal one, the number he gave to fewer than 10 people in the world, vibrated on the desk. He looked at the screen. Isla Sterling. He looked at it for the 3 seconds it rang before he picked it up. "Isla, I know you said you'd call me," she said. Her voice was measured, the tone of someone who had decided to say something and was committed to saying it directly. I know you have things happening that I'm not part of, but I've been sitting here for 2 days with that letter, and I needed to— A pause. I needed to hear your voice. I'm sorry if this is— Don't apologize, he said. A silence. Then, are you all right? He looked at the window, at the Chicago skyline, at the city he had built 15 years of the wrong life in. No, he said, which was the most honest answer he had given anyone in a very long time. She did not fill the silence with comfort. She sat in it with him, which was the thing he had needed without knowing he needed it. Is it bad? She said. It's manageable. He paused. That's what I always say. I know. Another pause. Adrian, whatever you're managing right now, I need you to come out of it on the other side. Whatever that means for you, I need you to— Her voice steadied. I spent 15 years building a life on a false foundation, and I am done doing that. I am done accepting the version of things that other people decided for me. So whatever decision you're sitting with right now, I need you to make the one that gets you out. He said nothing for a moment. I hear you, he said. Good. A breath. Call me when it's done. She ended the call. He set the phone on the desk and looked at it. Then he looked at the city. Then he looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had done things in this city that could not be undone, and thought about the version of himself that had climbed into a truck at 5 in the morning in Millhaven, Indiana, with nothing but a duffel bag and the hollow certainty that the life he had wanted was not available to him. That version of himself had made every subsequent decision from a place of having nothing left to lose. He was not that person anymore. He had something to lose now, and that changed the calculus in a way he had not anticipated. And the way it changed the calculus was this. A man with nothing to lose made decisions that were efficient but not survivable. A man with something to lose made decisions that were harder and slower and required him to be something other than the most dangerous thing in the room. He thought about what Isla had said. Make the one that gets you out. There was one option he had not yet fully examined because it was the option that required him to dismantle things, to accept a short-term position of vulnerability, to make himself smaller temporarily in order to become something different eventually. He had avoided examining it because it required a kind of trust that he had not been able to locate in himself for 15 years. He located it now. It was small and unsteady, and he had not used it in a long time. But it was there. He picked up his operational phone and called Dimitri. The Rourke meeting, he said. I need you to add someone to the room, someone Rourke won't expect. Who? Adrian looked at the city outside his window and made the decision that could not be unmade, the one that closed every door behind him except the one he was walking toward. Get me Richard Calloway, he said. Federal liaison, the one we've kept on standby for 2 years. A pause. Tell him I have documentation on the Harkin arrangement, and I want to discuss a structured cooperation agreement before the end of the day. The silence on Dimitri's end lasted 3 full seconds. You're sure, Dimitri said, which was the closest Dimitri had ever come to questioning him. Make the call, Adrian said. He set down the phone. Outside, Chicago moved through its afternoon with the absolute indifference of a city that did not adjust its pace for the decisions of the people inside it, and Adrian Volkov sat in his office and understood, with the cold, complete clarity of a man who had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, that the empire he had built in the wrong direction was about to be dismantled, and that the dismantling was going to cost him everything he had spent 15 years accumulating, and that this was, for the first time in 15 years, the correct decision. The most dangerous thing in the room was no longer the most useful thing to be. He had 3 hours. He picked up his pen and began to write. Richard Calloway arrived first. He was 51 years old, a federal liaison who had spent 20 years in positions that existed in the gray architecture between law enforcement and the kind of men who made law enforcement's job complicated. He was not FBI, and he was not DOJ, and his precise institutional affiliation was something Adrian had never asked, and Calloway had never volunteered because the utility of the relationship was premised on a mutual agreement not to examine its foundations too closely. He was thin, wore gray suits that looked like they had been chosen specifically to be forgettable, and he carried himself with the practiced neutrality of a man who had sat in a great many rooms with a great many people who would have preferred he wasn't there. He came in through this building's secondary entrance, which Dmitri had arranged, and he arrived in Adrian's office at 4:17 in the afternoon with a leather portfolio under his arm and the expression of a man who was not surprised to be here but had not expected the call quite yet. "Mr. Volkov," he said. "Sit down." Calloway sat. He did not open the portfolio. He looked at Adrian with the particular assessment of someone reading a situation before committing to a posture within it. "Dmitri said you have documentation." "I have the full Harkin arrangement. Principles, amounts, routing, timeline." Adrian kept his voice flat and his hands still on the desk. "I also have 8 months of communications between one of my operational coordinators and Marcus Rourke, documenting the systematic transfer of proprietary operational intelligence." Calloway's expression did not change, but something shifted in the quality of his attention. "Rourke. He'll be in this building in—" Adrian checked his watch. 47 minutes. He's coming to collect on the leverage that intelligence gave him. He doesn't know I have the log. He doesn't know you're here." A silence. Calloway tilted his head very slightly. "What are you offering?" "Structured cooperation. I give you the Harkin documentation and the communication log. I give you Rourke in this building today, making an extortion play on record. In exchange—" Adrian paused. "In exchange, I get a 12-month window to restructure the Volkov operation's non-legitimate activities into compliant architecture. No raids, no asset freezes, no federal attention on the transition process." Calloway looked at him for a long moment. "You're burning your own house down. I'm choosing which parts burn. Rourke will lawyer up inside 24 hours. His people will spend the next 18 months in a documentation review that makes the Harkin arrangement look like a parking violation." Adrian said. "You've been building a Rourke file for 3 years. I know because Rourke told Selby, and Selby told me, and I'm telling you, what I'm giving you today closes that file." Calloway opened the portfolio. He removed a single sheet of paper and set it on the desk between them. "Terms require sign-off from people above my authority. This process takes—" "I know how long the process takes." Adrian looked at the sheet. "I'm asking for a verbal agreement today, documented by your presence in this building during the Rourke meeting. The formal structure follows. But today, right now, I need to know that when Rourke walks out of here in handcuffs or walks out of here thinking he won and gets picked up on the street, the organization that takes him is the same one I'm cooperating with." Another silence. Calloway looked at the window, looked back. "You understand what you're giving up." "I understand exactly what I'm giving up. The Lakeview segment alone is worth—" "I know what it's worth." Adrian's voice did not rise. It dropped, which was the more dangerous direction. "I built it. I know what every piece of this is worth. I'm making a decision about what I want to still be standing when the accounting is done, and what I want to be standing isn't the Lakeview segment." He paused. "Are we in agreement or not?" Calloway looked at him for 10 full seconds. Then he picked up the sheet of paper, folded it, and put it back in the portfolio. "We're in agreement," he said. "Provisionally. Contingent on what happens in the next—" He checked his own watch. 43 minutes. "Good." Adrian picked up his phone and called Dmitri. "Put Calloway in the secondary conference room. Get him whatever he needs. Make sure the room's audio documentation is running." He set the phone down. "Dmitri will take you through." Calloway stood. At the office door, he paused without turning around. "One question." "Ask it." "Why now?" "You've had Selby's log for 48 hours. You could have moved on Rourke before the meeting, avoided the confrontation entirely." Adrian looked at the window, at the city. "Because I needed him in this building," he said. "In person. On record. Saying what he came here to say." He paused. "Some things need to be witnessed." Calloway left. Adrian sat alone for 11 minutes. He used 8 of them to review the documentation package he had assembled. Clean, organized, comprehensive. The work of a man who had spent 15 years building a system so well structured that dismantling it could be done with the same precision. The other 3 minutes he sat with his hands flat on the desk and breathed slowly, counting the breaths the way he had taught himself to do years ago when the operational pressure got to a level that required physiological management. His heart rate was elevated, not dramatically. The specific elevated register of someone whose body understood the stakes of the next hour, even when the mind was working to stay above them. He thought about Isla's voice on the phone. Make the one that gets you out. He heard the elevator at 5:02. Marcus Rourke was 55 years old, broad through the shoulders, in the way of a man who had been physically powerful at 30 and had allowed it to soften slightly without losing its fundamental structure. He had gray hair worn short and a face that had spent too many years in high-pressure environments, which gave it a particular compressed quality, the features arranged with an economy that left no room for expressiveness. He was wearing a dark coat over a suit that was good, but not exceptional, and he came through Adrian's office door with two men behind him, operational muscle, both of them in the 40 to 50 range, both carrying the stillness of professionals. Carver, in the doorway, looked at Adrian. Adrian gave the smallest nod. Carver stepped back and let them in, and positioned himself inside the door without being asked, which was correct procedure, and Adrian noted it. Rourke stopped 2 steps into the office, taking the room's measure with the assessment of a man accustomed to walking into rooms that had been arranged to his disadvantage. His eyes moved across the office. The desk, the window, Carver at the door, the empty secondary chair, and settled on Adrian. Volkov. Rourke, sit down. Rourke came to the desk and sat. A deliberate physical statement. Unhurried, settled, a man who was not concerned about who owned the room. His two men remained standing behind and to either side of him, which was positioning that Adrian noted and found mildly irritating in the way a thing was irritating when it was designed to be. Your men can wait in the hall, Adrian said. They're comfortable where they are. I wasn't asking. A beat. Something passed across Rourke's face, the assessment of whether to push on this point. And then he turned and gave a small gesture, and his men withdrew to the hallway. Carver closed the door. The office was very quiet. Rourke looked at Adrian with the expression of a man who had prepared for several versions of this conversation and was now selecting among them. I appreciate you taking the meeting directly, he said. Some men in your position would have sent someone. I don't send people to meetings I need to be present for. No, you don't. Rourke placed both hands on his knees. The Harkin arrangement. You want to tell me your read on the situation? My read, Adrian said, is that you manufactured a grievance to open this conversation, and the actual conversation you wanted to have is about the Lakeview segment. No pretense of surprise from Rourke. He acknowledged this with the slight inclination of his head of a man who respected directness even when it complicated his position. The Lakeview segment is a significant piece of territory. It overlaps with distribution infrastructure I've been developing for 2 years. The efficient arrangement would be a shared management structure. Shared meaning your management. Shared meaning a proportional arrangement reflecting the investment each party has made in the corridor's viability. Adrian looked at him. And if I decline the arrangement? Here it was. Rourke let the question sit for exactly the right amount of time. Not too fast, which would look rehearsed. Not too slow, which would look uncertain. The timing of a man who had practiced this moment. The Harkin documentation is a significant piece of exposure, he said. The kind of exposure that, presented to the right parties, generates federal attention of a scope and duration that makes running any operation very difficult. I'm not suggesting that outcome is in either of our interests. I'm suggesting that the alternative to it is a reasonable accommodation. You're suggesting, Adrian said, that you'll burn me if I don't give you what you want. Rourke's expression tightened slightly. I'm suggesting that reasonable men find accommodations. Where did you get the documentation? A pause. Something in Rourke's composure developed a hairline quality. Not cracking, but a shift in the texture of it. The barely perceptible adjustment of someone who had not expected this particular question at this particular moment. I don't see how. Gregor Selby, Adrian said. He's been in your pocket for 14 months. He gave you the Harkin documentation 10 days ago, which is when you decided the timing was right for this conversation. Adrian's voice was absolutely flat. What I want to know is whether Selby came to you or you came to him. Rourke went very still. The kind of stillness that was not composure, but the temporary suspension of it, while the mind worked rapidly through the implications of the information just presented. You came to him, Adrian said. You identified Selby as a potential resource approximately 16 months ago, which means you had been building this play for over a year before the Harkin arrangement even existed. The Harkin arrangement was a trigger, not a cause. You were waiting for something to trigger on. He paused. Who told you Selby was accessible? I think, Rourke started. Who told you? The voice that came out of Adrian was not loud. It was the voice that existed at the far edge of his controlled register. The voice that had a quality in it that people in his world understood as the sound of something that had made a final decision and was now in the process of executing it. Rourke heard it. Adrian watched him hear it. Watched something recalibrate behind Rourke's eyes, in the rapid way of a man who had walked into a room expecting one kind of meeting and was now understanding he was in a different kind entirely. This conversation isn't going the way you planned, Rourke said. Not a question. No. You have something you're not showing me. Several things. Rourke's hands moved on his knees. A small movement, the fingers pressing slightly into the fabric of his trousers and releasing. The first genuinely involuntary physical gesture he had made since sitting down. Then show me. Adrian reached into the desk drawer and removed a single printed document. He set it on the desk and slid it across to Rourke. It was the first page of the communications log, the summary sheet that Dimitri's technical team had prepared, showing the contact pattern in clean, readable format with the relay trace and the endpoint phone registration information on the bottom third of the page. Rourke looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. The color in his face changed by a degree. Not dramatically, but the particular shift that happened when blood pressure responded to a psychological shock. His jaw set very slightly. This is your problem too, he said. His voice was still controlled, but the control had a different quality now. The control of someone working from a defensive rather than offensive position. This document implicates the Harkin arrangement as much as, I know what it implicates, Adrian said. I've already addressed that. Another stillness from Rourke, longer this time. You haven't, Rourke said. You can't have. There's no... Who did you... He stopped. Something moved through his face rapidly, and then was suppressed rapidly, but not rapidly enough. And what Adrian saw in its passage was the thing he had been looking for, genuine alarm. Not the managed alarm of a man who was rebalancing his tactical position. The real kind. The kind that meant Rourke was running the calculations and coming up with results he had not prepared for. There's no one you could go to with the Harkin documentation who wouldn't... There is someone, Adrian said. He's in this building right now. The silence that followed was the loudest silence in the room since the meeting had begun. Rourke's hands had gone completely still on his knees. His eyes were fixed on Adrian's face with the intensity of a man who was reading every available detail, searching for the indicator that this was a bluff, that the room contained only what it had appeared to contain when he walked in. He did not find that indicator because it was not there to find. Federal, Rourke said, very quietly. Adrian said nothing. You... Rourke's voice stopped. Started. The control was showing its seams now, the careful surface of the man he had been 10 minutes ago, developing fractures that were visible in the tight line of his mouth, the way his shoulders had moved almost imperceptibly forward from their settled position. You're burning everything. You know that. Everything you've built here. Everything you... I know what I'm burning, Adrian said. For what? The question came out with more rawness than Rourke had intended. Adrian could hear it. The genuine incomprehension of a man who had built his life on the same principles Adrian had built his and could not process the decision to abandon them. This is everything you have. No, Adrian said. It's everything I built. That's not the same thing. Rourke stared at him. Here's what happens now, Adrian said. You're going to sit in that chair while I make a call. The man in the secondary conference room is going to come in here. You're going to answer his questions accurately and completely, and in exchange for that accuracy and completeness, the shape of what happens to you over the next 2 years will be significantly less catastrophic than the alternative. He paused. Or you can stand up and walk out that door and get in your car and drive back to whatever you came from, and the file that's being assembled right now will be submitted without your cooperation, which means the shape of what happens to you over the next 2 years will be determined entirely by people who have no reason to be generous. Rourke was breathing harder now, not gasping. The controlled, pressured breathing of someone whose body was responding to fight-or-flight stimulus that their professional training was preventing them from acting on. Your lawyers will need the next 18 months just to understand the scope of the documentation, Adrian said. Cooperate now. The window for that option is closing. A long moment. The October light through the office windows had shifted to the late afternoon angle that made everything in Chicago look like a photograph of itself. Flat, golden, slightly unreal. Somewhere in the building, in a secondary conference room, Richard Calloway was sitting with his portfolio and waiting. Rourke looked at the document on the desk between them. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up at Adrian, and what was in his face in that moment was something Adrian had not expected to recognize but did. The look of a man who had just run out of options and was in the process of accepting that fact with whatever dignity the moment allowed. "Make your call," Rourke said. Adrian picked up the phone. What followed was 40 minutes that Adrian experienced with the particular hyperclarity of extreme operational pressure. Sounds sharpened, physical details vivid and precise. The passage of time both accelerated and granular. Calloway entered the office with a second man Adrian had not seen before. Younger, with a recording device that was placed on the desk without ceremony. Rourke answered questions in the flat monotone of a man who had made a calculation and was executing it without permitting himself to feel it. Names, dates, arrangements. The identity of the person who had directed him toward Selby as a potential resource, a name Adrian did not recognize, which meant there was a layer he had not yet seen, which meant the full scope of what had been built against him was larger than the Rourke meeting had suggested. He filed that information away. Later. There would be a later now, which was not something he had been certain of 2 hours ago. At 6:43, Calloway closed his portfolio and stood, and the younger man with the recording device followed. Rourke remained in the chair across from Adrian's desk, not restrained, not formally arrested, not yet, because the process required processes, but present, contained, the forward energy of him entirely dissipated, and two men Adrian had not seen enter the building now standing inside the office door. Calloway looked at Adrian on his way out. A brief look. Professional, without warmth, without hostility. The look of a transaction concluded. "We'll be in touch," he said. "I know," Adrian said. They left. Adrian sat alone in the office with the Chicago skyline outside the window going dark, the last of the October light bleeding out of it, the city shifting into its nighttime version, harder, brighter, the specific beauty of a place that was fully itself only after dark. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way he was not usually aware of it. The elevated rate of the last 2 hours was beginning to settle, not rapidly, but gradually. The physiological machinery downshifting with the particular reluctance of a system that had been running at high output and needed time to understand it was no longer necessary. His phone was on the desk. Isla's business card was in his breast pocket. He could feel its edge through the fabric of his jacket, which was a physical sensation he was aware of with a precision that was disproportionate to its significance, except that it wasn't disproportionate because the card and the person it represented were the reason the decision of the last 2 hours was the decision it had been, instead of a different one. He had given up the Volkov empire tonight. Not completely, not immediately. The 12-month restructuring window meant there was a process, a managed transition. The legitimate businesses would survive, and some of what had built them would be retooled rather than dismantled. But the operation as it had existed for 15 years, the network he had constructed in the absence of a life he had wanted, was over. The decision was made and it was irreversible, and the part of him that had lived inside that operation for 15 years was standing in the rubble of it and trying to determine what the ground felt like underfoot. Solid, he thought. It felt solid, which was something he had not expected. He was reaching for his phone when the office door opened and Carver came in with his jacket slightly displaced from its usual precise fit, which was the first time in 6 years Adrian had seen Carver's jacket displaced, and his face had the expression Adrian had learned to read as the precursor to serious information. "What?" Adrian said. "Selby," Carver said. "He's gone." Adrian went very still. "What do you mean he's gone?" "I had him in the secondary holding space on 11. I stepped out for 8 minutes to rotate someone. 8 minutes. And when I came back, he was gone. Windows open." Carver's voice was controlled and flat, carrying the weight of a man delivering a failure. "He must have had a secondary phone, something I missed." Adrian stood up slowly. "Who did he call?" "I don't know." "How long ago?" "We're looking at a 40-minute window, give or take. 40 minutes. During which Adrian had been in this office with Rourke and Calloway, with the building's focus entirely on the meeting, with Selby presumably tucked away and contained and no longer a variable in the evening's calculus. 40 minutes in which Gregor Selby had made a phone call to someone. Not Rourke. Rourke was in this building, but someone else. The layer Adrian had not yet seen, the name he did not recognize, and had communicated something. What had he communicated? Adrian looked at his phone, then at the window, then back at Carver. "Get the car," he said. "Now." Carver moved toward the door. "Carver." The words stopped him. Adrian picked up his personal phone from the desk and looked at Isla's number in the recent calls list. And what he felt in his chest in that moment was not the cold operational clarity of a man running a network. It was something rawer and more specific. The thing you felt when the machinery of your professional life had just produced an unpredictable variable, and the variable had a vector that pointed toward the one thing you had, after 15 years, finally allowed yourself to value. "The Sterling woman," he said. "Columbus. I need someone on her location tonight." He paused. Quietly. "Protective, not surveillance. She doesn't know." Carver read him. "Done," he said. They left the office. The elevator descended through the Volkov building's 14 floors, and Adrian stood in it with his hands loose at his sides and his heart at the elevated rate it had almost settled from, and the certainty, cold, precise, non-negotiable, that Gregor Selby had spent 8 months feeding information to people who wanted Adrian Volkov dismantled, and that the dismantling Adrian had chosen tonight was not the dismantling those people had planned, and that the difference between those two versions of the outcome was something they were not going to accept without a response. The elevator reached the ground floor, the doors opened. Carver was already moving toward the escalade when his phone went off, and he stopped and looked at the screen and turned back to Adrian with the expression that had only one meaning in their working relationship. "It's not Selby," Carver said. "It's Columbus." The ground did not feel solid anymore. Adrian took the phone. The call lasted 40 seconds. The voice on the other end was not Isla. It was the operative Adrian had dispatched to Columbus, a man named Trent, who had been with the organization for 7 years, and who communicated with the economy of someone trained to deliver maximum information in minimum time. What he communicated in 40 seconds was this. Isla Sterling's apartment building had been accessed by 2 men in the last 20 minutes. One had gone to the lobby and asked for her by name. The second had positioned himself at the building's rear exit. Trent had arrived 4 minutes after the access and was currently watching from a vehicle across the street. Isla was inside. The lights in her unit were on. Adrian handed the phone back to Carver while they were still moving. "Drive," he said. They were in the Escalade before the word finished. Carver understood the direction without being told. North to the expressway, 90 miles to Columbus. The specific calculus of distance against time that Adrian was already running in his head and did not like the results of. 90 miles, 70, 75 minutes depending on traffic and how hard Carver pushed it, and Carver would push it. He called Trent back on his own phone. "Status? Lobby man is still inside. Rear man hasn't moved. Nobody's gone up yet that I've seen." A pause. "There are 2 units above hers. Building has 12 floors. Her unit is 604. Does she know anyone is there?" "I don't think so. Her lights have been on steady. No movement I can read from the street. Call the building's front desk. Tell them there's a gas smell in the lobby and they need to evacuate the building. Do it in the next 2 minutes. A brief silence. "That clears our lobby, man. It clears the building. I don't want anyone else in it when this resolves." He paused. "Get to her floor before the lobby man gets back inside. When the evacuation starts, you go up. You get to her door and you keep her in that unit until I tell you otherwise. If anyone comes through that stairwell door before I arrive, you handle it." "Understood." He ended the call. The Escalade hit the expressway doing 80 and climbing. Chicago's south edge slid past the windows and became the flat dark of the interstate, and Adrian sat in the back seat with his phone in his hand and the particular internal stillness of someone who had learned decades ago that panic was a luxury that cost more than it provided. The stillness was real and it was functional, and underneath it was something else entirely. Something that had a name he was not going to examine at 75 miles per hour in the back of a car because the naming of it required conditions he did not currently have. He called Dmitri. Selby made contact with someone before he went through the window, he said. I need the name I didn't recognize from the Rourke meeting. The one Rourke gave Calloway, the person who directed him toward Selby. Get it from Calloway's people, if you have to. I need it in the next 30 minutes. Working, Dimitri said, and disconnected. Then Adrian sat with the moving dark outside the window and thought about the architecture of what had been built against him, and thought about how far back it went, and thought about Gregor Selby sitting in a chair across from him for 4 years and carrying the specific knowledge that Adrian's entire operational structure rested on a small number of trusted people who were trusted because they had been vetted and because they had demonstrated loyalty over time. And the specific vulnerability of that kind of trust, which was that it was extended precisely to the people in the best position to exploit it. Selby had not acted alone. That was the thing he was certain of. The communications log covered 8 months, and Rourke had been building for 14. But the name Rourke had given Calloway, the original architect of the approach to Selby, suggested a third party whose involvement predated both Rourke and Selby's cooperation. Someone who had identified, earlier than Rourke, that the correct way to dismantle Adrian Volkov was not direct confrontation but patient internal erosion. Someone who had been patient enough to spend more than a year building the conditions for tonight. He was 40 miles outside Columbus when Dimitri called back. The name, Dimitri said. Vincent Hara. He's not operational, he's financial. He runs a private equity structure that has been acquiring distressed assets in the distribution corridor for the last 2 years. A pause. He has 3 holding companies with positions in properties that directly overlap with the Lakeview segment. He's not buying territory, Adrian said. He's buying the infrastructure that becomes valuable when the Lakeview segment is available. That's how it looks. He anticipated the restructuring before tonight. He was building for a version of the Volkov operation that had already been dismantled. Adrian paused. He knew about Calloway. A silence from Dimitri that confirmed it. Selby told Rourke about the federal liaison, Adrian said. Rourke told Hara. Hara understood that the Calloway relationship meant I had an exit strategy, which meant the restructuring was a real possibility, which meant his acquisition play had a viable endpoint. He paused. He wasn't trying to stop me from cooperating with Federal. He was accelerating it. He wanted the Volkov operation dismantled because the assets become accessible when it is. And Isla Sterling. Leverage, Adrian said. The word came out flat and cold. Not to stop me. Too late for that. To negotiate the terms of the transition, specifically the Lakeview segment, which Hara needs unencumbered to make his acquisition play work. He paused. Get me Hara's phone number, now. Dimitri had it in 4 minutes. Adrian called it. Hara picked up on the second ring, which meant he was expecting the call, which meant he had been told that Trent had been spotted outside Isla's building, which meant his people had made Trent and had reported upward, and the whole chain of information had moved fast enough that Hara was sitting somewhere with his phone and waiting. Mr. Volkov, Hara said. His voice was even, measured, with the particular precision of a financial man. Not the rougher operational energy of Rourke, but something smoother and colder, the voice of someone who moved money rather than men and considered the distinction a mark of sophistication. I expected your call somewhat sooner. Where are your people? Adrian said. In Columbus, as I imagine you're aware. Call them off. That's a short conversation for someone in your position. Call them off, Adrian said again. Same tone, same register. I'm going to say this once, and I need you to hear it precisely. The Lakeview segment is included in the cooperation agreement I signed today. It is no longer an asset I control or can transfer. If your acquisition play requires an unencumbered Lakeview segment, it requires something that no longer exists, and the men you have in Columbus are leverage against something you cannot have, regardless of how this conversation ends. A silence from Hara, longer than the silences Rourke had produced. The silence of a man doing faster and more complex arithmetic. The cooperation agreement covers Lakeview explicitly, Hara said, confirming, not questioning. Explicitly and comprehensively. Another silence. That was faster than our modeling suggested. Your modeling was based on information Selby had 8 months ago. The situation changed. I see. A pause. The woman in Columbus is not a productive variable in this conversation then. No, she's not. Then I have no reason to maintain a position there. The smoothness of it was its own kind of cold. Not the cold of malice, but the cold of pure transaction, the kind of man for whom people were variables that became irrelevant when the calculation changed. My people will withdraw. Your people will withdraw in the next 5 minutes, Adrian said. I have someone in that building. If anyone goes through a stairwell door in the next 5 minutes, the conversation we're having right now gets a different ending. 5 minutes, Hara said. Agreed. And Hara, Adrian's voice dropped to the register that had produced results in every room he had ever used it in. The acquisition play, the holding companies, the infrastructure positions in the corridor. I want them unwound. A pause. That's a significant ask. It's not an ask. The silence that followed had a different quality from the preceding ones. Not the silence of calculation, the silence of a man reassessing the nature of the conversation he was in. I'll need time, Hara said. You have 90 days. Dmitri will be in touch with the documentation requirements. Adrian paused. If I find out you've spent those 90 days building something else instead of unwinding what you have, the cooperation agreement I signed today is going to get an addendum with your name on it. Are we clear? We're clear, Hara said. The smoothness was still there, but underneath it something had compressed. The way things compressed when a man understood that the room he was in was not the room he had thought he was walking into. Adrian ended the call. He called Trent. Stand down. They're pulling out. Give it 5 minutes, then get her out of the building and somewhere public. A restaurant, a coffee shop, anywhere with people. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Copy, Trent said. He put the phone in his pocket and sat back and closed his eyes for the first time in approximately 4 hours, which was not sleep and was not rest, but was the specific act of a man who needed 10 seconds of dark and quiet before the next thing. Carver drove. The expressway unreeled beneath them. Columbus was close now, its light pollution visible against the low cloud, the particular orange smear of a mid-sized American city seen from the highway at night. He thought about Gregor Selby, who had not been found, and who Adrian had made a decision about in the last 4 hours that was different from the decision he would have made 2 days ago, which was that Selby was a problem for the federal cooperation process rather than a problem for the Volkov network's internal resolution mechanisms. That decision had cost him something operationally. He had made it anyway. He was still finding the edges of what the decision meant about who he was becoming. He thought about Celeste Sterling in a ranch house on Decker Lane, with a shoebox in a closet and 15 years of a specific weight. He thought about what it cost a person to carry something like that and what it did to the architecture of their daily life, the constant low-level management of a lie that had calcified into a foundational structure. He had spent his career understanding leverage, and what Celeste had held over herself, the knowledge of what she had done and what it had cost, was the most corrosive kind of leverage there was. Self-applied, inescapable. He did not forgive her. He was not built for the quick version of forgiveness, and he did not pretend to be. But he understood her, which was different, and understanding without forgiveness was a position he could occupy without it costing him anything he couldn't afford to spend. The Escalade took the Columbus exit. Trent's text came through at 11:47. Both subjects out of the building, a coffee place on High Street, 3 blocks east. He sent the address. Carver pulled up outside at 11:53. The coffee shop was the kind of place that stayed open late for the university crowd. Exposed brick, pendant lights, the smell of roasted beans, and the low ambient noise of a dozen separate conversations. Trent was at a table near the window, visible from the street, with the specific posture of a man who was watching every entrance simultaneously while appearing to do nothing of the kind. And across the table from Trent, with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and her dark hair loose, and her face carrying the particular exhausted alertness of someone who had been told to leave their apartment building at 11 at night without being given a complete explanation, was Isla Sterling. She saw him come through the door. She did not stand up immediately. She watched him cross the coffee shop toward her with an expression that was doing several things at once, reading him for damage, processing the hour and the circumstance, absorbing the quality of what was in his face, which he was not making any effort to manage or contain. Let her read it, he thought. He was done with the containment. He sat down across from her. Trent stood and moved to a table 2 positions away without needing to be told. Isla looked at him. Are you hurt? No. Are you? She stopped, looked at his face more carefully. What happened? A lot of things. He put both hands flat on the table, which was an unusual physical gesture for him, and he knew it, and he did not adjust it. You're all right. I'm fine. Your man... She glanced at Trent. He knocked on my door and told me there was a gas situation in the building and he was going to take me somewhere to wait. He was very polite about it. A pause. It wasn't a gas situation. No. Was it because of you? He looked at her directly. Yes. She absorbed this. She did not look away. She did not perform fear or anger. She sat with the information the way she sat with most things, fully and without flinching. Is it resolved? Yes, completely. Completely, he said. There's a process that runs from tonight for the next year that I'll need to be present for. But the immediate situation, the people who created it, that's resolved. She looked at her coffee cup, then back at him. Tell me what you did. He told her. Not the full operational detail, not because he was protecting her from it, but because the full operational detail was not the part that mattered for what this conversation needed to be. He told her about Selby, about Rourke, about Calloway, and the cooperation agreement. He told her about Hara and the phone call from the Escalade. He told her that the Empire, the 15-year structure he had built in Chicago in the wrong direction, was in the process of being dismantled in a controlled way that he had chosen, and that the choosing of it had been the hardest thing he had done since climbing into a truck at 5 in the morning in Millhaven with nothing but a duffel bag and the wrong certainty. Isla listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, her hands still around the coffee cup, her eyes on his face. You didn't have to do that, she said. You could have fought Rourke. You could have... There were other options. There were, he said. I chose this one. Because of the letter, he thought about that. Because of what the letter meant about what I had been doing for 15 years and why. And because of what you said on the phone, he paused. Make the one that gets you out. I've been making decisions that kept me in for a very long time. I made a different kind tonight. She looked at him for a long time. The coffee shop moved around them. Late-night students, a couple near the back, the barista doing something with equipment at the counter, the ambient noise of people living their ordinary lives inside a late October night. I need to ask you something, Isla said, and I need you to be as honest with me as you have been tonight, because I am too old and too tired to manage anything less than that. Ask it. Is this... She paused, found the word. Is this something between us? Or is tonight a thing that happened and I need to find a way to make it make sense without... She stopped. The precision of her was visible in the effort of the stopping. A woman who was choosing her words the way she had chosen the words of the letter at 18, carefully enough to be able to survive whatever response she received. I am not 18 years old anymore. I cannot absorb another 15 years of a wrong assumption, so I need you to tell me straight. Adrian looked at her. He thought about the 4 years in Millhaven, watching her across classrooms and telling himself it was not specific to him. He thought about 5 in the morning and a truck and the flat certainty of a man who had decided the wanting of things was a liability. He thought about the letter in Isla's handwriting with his name on the front, sealed for 15 years, unbroken, and the way her voice had sounded reading it, and the way her palm had been flat on the pages when she was done. I drove to Columbus at midnight, he said. On the night I dismantled everything I spent 15 years building. That should answer the question. Something moved across Isla's face. It was not a smile. It was more serious than a smile. Something that lived in the territory past smiling. The expression of a person receiving a true thing and letting themselves receive it without protection. Her eyes were very bright in the pendant light of the coffee shop, and she did not blink, and she did not look away. Okay, she said, very quietly. Okay. They sat in the coffee shop until nearly 2 in the morning. They did not talk about the future in the way of people making plans. They talked in the way of 2 people who had just survived the same storm from different positions and were in the process of finding out whether the ground between them was solid. It was the kind of talking that had no performance in it, no management, no version of themselves presented for assessment. It was 2 people in a coffee shop on High Street in Columbus, Ohio at 2 in the morning, being exactly who they were. Carver had found a parking spot. Trent had relocated to the doorway. The barista had stopped noticing them. At some point, Isla reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not holding it, just placing it there, palm down, a point of contact. The same brief overlap of fingers that had happened twice in a ranch house on Decker Lane in Mill Haven and had registered in him with a precision disproportionate to its size. He turned his hand over. She did not withdraw hers. They stayed like that for a while. The weeks that followed were not simple, and Adrian had not expected them to be. The cooperation process with Calloway's office required the kind of sustained, focused engagement that left him with 4-hour nights and 10-hour days. The documentation of 15 years of operational history in a format that satisfied federal requirements while protecting the legitimate business architecture he was preserving. Dimitri proved essential, and Adrian told him so, which was not something he had made a habit of, and which Dimitri received with the particular quiet dignity of a man who had been waiting a long time to hear it. Gregor Selby was found in Indianapolis 3 weeks after the Rourke meeting, located through the federal process rather than through anything Adrian arranged, which was how Adrian had decided it would go and which cost him something in the estimation of certain people in his former world who considered the decision a weakness. He let them consider it. What other people called weakness and what Adrian had decided to call survival were not the same thing, and he was no longer interested in managing the distinction for other people's benefit. Vincent Hara unwound the holding companies inside 60 days. The documentation came through Dimitri and was verified, and Adrian noted it and moved on, because the Hara situation was a finished thing, and finished things did not require continued attention. Marcus Rourke's cooperation with Calloway's office produced a federal case that took 7 months to formally open and would take years to conclude. Adrian's role in it was as a cooperating party, which was a different thing from what he had been in the world he was exiting, and he occupied the difference with the same deliberate intentionality he had brought to everything for 15 years, just directed finally in a direction that was not away from something. Celeste Sterling called Isla in November. Isla told Adrian about the call without being asked, which was the kind of transparency he was not accustomed to and which he was actively learning to receive. The call had been short. Celeste had not asked for forgiveness, and Isla had not offered it. What they had agreed to was the beginning of something that was not reconciliation, but was the preliminary condition for the possibility of it. The acknowledgement that the damage existed, that it was not going to be resolved quickly, and that neither of them was willing to let it be the permanent definition of their relationship. He thought that was probably the most honest outcome available, and he thought Isla had navigated it with the specific kind of courage that required you to hold two contradictory things at once, the reality of being hurt and the refusal to let the hurt be the last word. He told her so. She said, "You're still not used to saying what you actually think, are you?" He said, "I'm practicing." She said, "Good." In December, Isla accepted a position with a design studio in Chicago. She did not accept it because of Adrian, and she told him so, and he believed her. And then she told him that his being in Chicago was not a factor, which was the kind of honest complexity he was finding he appreciated more than he had capacity for, which meant his capacity was expanding. He helped her move. He was not a man who had ever helped anyone move, and the process involved more cardboard boxes and more deliberate problem-solving than he had anticipated. And at one point, he was standing in the hallway of her new apartment on the north side of Chicago, holding a lamp he had run out of room to put down, and she came around the corner and saw him, and laughed. And it was the first time he had heard her laugh in the unguarded way that did not involve managing the situation around it. And it was the best sound he had encountered in 15 years. He did not say that out loud. He was practicing, not transformed. On the day they finished moving, after the boxes were stacked and the furniture was roughly in place, and they were eating takeout on the floor because the couch was still in the wrong position, Isla disappeared into one of the boxes and came back with the framed letter. She held it for a moment. The cream envelope, his name in her 18-year-old hand on the front, the pages inside visible through the glass of the frame, and looked at it with an expression he had learned to read as the one she wore when she was integrating something. Then she crossed to the wall above the small bookshelf and found the nail she had apparently planned for it, and hung it there. He looked at it on the wall, the thing that had been sealed for 15 years, now framed and present, not hidden, not carried in a shoebox, but placed in the light of a room where two people were going to live their lives. "You're sure?" he said. "It's not a wound anymore," she said. She sat back down across from him and picked up her takeout container. "It's evidence." "Of what?" She looked at him. "That some things survive being buried." A pause. "Even by the people who were supposed to take care of them." He looked at the letter on the wall, then at her. There was a thing he wanted to say, and he was finding the way toward it, which was slower than he would have liked, but more honest than the alternative. "I'm not going to be easy," he said. I don't have a version of myself that's easy. I have 15 years of habits built for a life I'm not living anymore, and some of those habits are going to require," he paused, "time and patience that I am not necessarily going to be able to ask for in the right way." Isla looked at him steadily. "I know who you are, Adrian. You know who I was at 18 and who I was at 33 at a reunion and who I've been for the last 2 months while the ground shifted. That's not—" "I know who you are," she said again, with the particular quiet finality of someone who had thought about this more thoroughly than the statement suggested. "I'm not interested in the easy version. I tried that twice and it didn't hold because it wasn't real." She set down her container. "I want the real thing, even if it's difficult, especially if it's difficult, actually, because difficult things that hold are worth more than easy things that don't." He looked at her for a long time. "Okay," he said, which was the same word she had said to him in a coffee shop at 2 a.m. 6 weeks ago. And it carried the same weight now that it had carried then, and she understood that. He could see her understand it, and the understanding between them had the quality of something that had been tested in conditions that were not gentle and had held, which was the only kind of understanding he had ever been able to trust. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in December. Gray sky, cold with serious intent, the lake somewhere to the east pressing cold air through the streets with the specific indifference of a force that did not adjust its behavior for the preferences of the people in its path. It was the city he had built a wrong life in for 15 years, and it was the city where he was going to build a different kind of life, starting now. And it looked exactly the same as it had always looked, which was the thing about cities and about people too. The change was internal, always, and the landscape held its shape regardless, and you did not wait for the landscape to change to begin. Every year after that, on the anniversary of the reunion, Isla left a handwritten letter on the kitchen table. The first one was short, 6 lines, in the same careful slanted hand as the letter in the frame. He read it standing at the kitchen table in the morning before she was awake, in the December gray of a Chicago morning, with his coffee getting cold because he had forgotten it was there. He sat down at the table and he wrote back. Not 6 lines, more than that. He was unpracticed, and it showed. The sentences were not elegant, and the structure was not what he would have produced in any professional context. But they were honest in the way that only things written slowly and with difficulty were honest. The words of a man who had spent 15 years building walls and was now, one letter at a time, taking them apart. He folded the pages and put them in an envelope and left it on the table next to hers. When she came into the kitchen and found them both there, her letter and his answer side by side, she stood at the table for a moment and looked at them and did not say anything. She picked up his letter and read it. He watched her read it and did not speak and did not look away, which was the hardest part, and also the part that mattered most. When she finished, she folded it carefully and set it back on the table, and she looked at him with an expression that was the fullest thing he had seen on a human face in as long as he could remember. Not happiness exactly, not relief, but something that contained both of those things and was larger than either of them. The expression of a person who has been carrying a long weight and has set it down in a place where it can finally rest. "Next year," she said, "try to use more than one adjective per paragraph." He looked at her. "I make no promises." She smiled, the unguarded kind. Outside, the city held its shape. Inside, 2 people sat at a kitchen table with their letters between them, in the ordinary December morning of a life that had taken 15 years and a stolen envelope and a midnight drive, and the hardest decision either of them had ever made to arrive at, and which was, for all of that, or perhaps because of all of that, exactly what it was supposed to be. The letter in the frame caught the morning light. The seal that had been unbroken for 15 years was broken now, and what had been inside it was no longer hidden. It was here, present, lived in, the foundation of something real. That was enough. That was finally everything.